Gideon Sjoberg, born to Swedish immigrant parents, earned a PhD at Washington State University and eventually moved to the University of Texas at Austin. This article about the pre-industrial city, published in 1955, a few years after the previous article by V. Gordon Childe, is important because it presents a brief early summary of Sjoberg's full-length book with the same title, published 5 years later on the same subject. By using the singular city rather than cities in his title, Sjoberg immediately communicates his basic message, that all ancient cities everywhere in the world shared certain important common features because they faced similar social and environmental constraints. His thesis that pre-industrial urban forms in very different historical periods all follow similar rules of structure and social composition remains an important generalization in social science. Even scholars who later searched for subcategories within his broad distinction between pre-industrial and industrial societies have preserved this basic distinction and his labels for it. Gave his 1955 article in the American Journal of Sociology the same title that he later used for the full-length book he published in 1960. This title nicely states his thesis that all cities everywhere can be divided into two distinct groups, pre-industrial and industrial. Despite the great diversity we can observe in individual cities around the world, he suggests that each group of cities shares certain common features that set them apart from each other. When he eventually produced a full book manuscript on this subject, he also gave it the subtitle Past and Present, implying that some of the cities in the world today may still be pre-industrial, although the Industrial Revolution began in northwestern Europe over 200 years ago. Sjoberg insists that some cities in some parts of the world, especially the so-called Third World, still fit his profile of ancient cities such as Athens, Rome, or Babylon. In fact, Sjoberg uses this similarity between ancient cities and the contemporary Third World as part of the justification for writing the article and eventually the book. He declares that a closer study of the common features shared by all these pre-industrial cities might actually be useful for understanding the urbanization that was then taking place in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. A half-century ago, this amounted to a tantalizing new possibility for coming to grips with the rapid social changes sweeping through the developing world. A spirited debate followed over the next couple of decades about whether his link between ancient and some contemporary cities was actually a productive approach to understanding the Third World. So it's helpful to get a clear understanding of exactly what Sjoberg was trying to say. He was correct. Some common profile that fits cities all over the world and down through all of human history, except for the recent period of what he calls industrial civilization. The first thing he must do in his article, then, is to spell out this profile. We already know how V. Gordon Childe drew a dividing line between the earliest cities and the smaller, simpler Neolithic villages that came before. Interestingly, Sjoberg never cites Childe's article, published 5 years earlier, even though he adopts essentially the same features singled out by Childe in his own recipe for the pre-industrial city. Maybe he simply didn't read the Town Planning Review, or maybe he had a problem with Childe's Marxist orientation. There's no argument between them, however, on the hallmarks of the first pre-industrial cities. Sjoberg divides his article into three main sections, dealing with the ecological or spatial pattern found in all these cities, the economic system of producing goods and services in all these cities, and the social details of family and community life in all these cities. In each of the three sections, he highlights what all pre-industrial cities, past and present, have in common. A huge wall encircling the entire city forms one of the hallmarks of ancient pre-industrial cities. Right away, then, we have one potential problem equating these ancient cities with contemporary pre-industrial cities. The walls around these ancient cities mark the effective boundary of the city as a sovereign political force. Outside the walls, the city's army of warriors might range far and wide over the countryside and claim vast territories from which to extract food and other resources, but there were no clear fixed boundaries between empires centered in such cities. That was the age of the city-state, with the city itself as the basic building block of political life. Today we live in the age of the nation-state instead. Cities no longer have their own armies. They no longer print their own money. They no longer constitute sovereign political units, so they no longer build walls around their outer edges. We have seen Child's explanation in the last article of how the ruling elites used control of the food supply to get the mass of common people to work on huge projects. Once built, such a walled city created security and increased the control of the elite over the city's population, and also clearly marked such cities as something new compared to little Neolithic villages. The ancient walls of Ur in Mesopotamia were reputed to be so massive that 6 chariots could drive abreast along the top of them. The epic of the ancient hero Gilgamesh celebrates mainly the fact that he was the warrior king who masterminded the building of these walls. These local ruling elites with absolute power over the other residents of the city also don't match up with Sjoberg's claim that third world cities today belong in the same category. Just as these third world cities have no walls, their elites may have enormous power, but they ultimately answer to an even more centralized national elite. If one great city dominates such a country, we may perhaps find a better match to Sjoberg's ancient cities, as we'll see in a later reading. Sjoberg adds to this topic by pointing out the relatively compact area inside these walls often got subdivided into smaller areas, sometimes called quarters, that were segregated from each other in many ways. For example, the ancient walls of Jerusalem, around what is now called the Old City, surround 4 well-known and distinct areas: the Christian quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Muslim quarter, and the Armenian quarter. There happen to be 4 quarters in Jerusalem, but an ancient city could have many more than just 4 such areas, and they would still be called quarters. If walls separated these quarters, sometimes these interior walls would also have gates that could be locked against outsiders. Sometimes the quarters were segregated by ethnicity, using criteria such as language, religion, or common historical identity. Sometimes you could also find quarters that concentrated certain kinds of occupations, such as a neighborhood concentrating together all the goldsmiths in the city, or all the weavers, or the shoemakers, or other craft specialties. Despite sometimes living together in their own neighborhoods, these diverse groups of non-agricultural specialists were crowded together into the walled confines of pre-industrial cities so that they could not avoid coming into contact with each other almost constantly in the course of everyday life. Sjoberg points out that the inefficient agricultural methods of these pre-industrial civilizations produce only a very small surplus of food above what was needed to support the farmers themselves. He suggests that it took about 10 peasant farmers, most of them living out in the rural countryside around the city, to support just 1 urban resident. Some of the most successful of these peasant farmers may have been able to move into the city themselves and to live there as absentee landlords, but then it would take 10 other farmers just to support each one of them as well. Over generations, these landlord families, basing their power on control of rural land, might actually gain enough influence to join the urban elite. The cramped area inside the city walls led to narrow, twisting lanes and passages in most of the cities, although some places like Rome deliberately created a few broad boulevards leading from the gates in the city wall into the heart of the city. The lack of any transportation other than beasts of burden, including some population groups such as slaves, who were themselves often beasts of burden, made it difficult to move goods around these awkward streets, so productive activities tended to cluster together near each other and near the central marketplace where they could sell their products. Pre-industrial cities were usually not only crowded, but very unsanitary. They smelled bad. Streets were often built in a V shape with a low point in the center of the street so that open sewage could collect there and flow away, hopefully out of the city through a low arch somewhere in the walls. Only in a few places like ancient Rome did a pre-industrial city manage to build infrastructure such as aqueducts and sewers to reduce this sanitation problem somewhat. This crowded, unsanitary aspect of pre-industrial cities produced another feature shared by all of them, and here we find a better match with cities in the contemporary world that Sjoberg would call pre-industrial, at least until very recently. The unhealthy conditions meant that death rates were almost always higher than birth rates in these cities, so they actually formed what we might call a population sink. That is, a constant flow of population from the countryside into the city was needed just to keep the population at a steady level. Sjoberg did not write about this demographic feature, but it adds another item to the list of similarities between all pre-industrial cities. The ruling elite in these cities, the alliance of warriors and priests described by Child in the previous article, did not feel the problems of urban life as much as the ordinary residents did. Sjoberg includes powerful landowning families as well as the religious leaders and the governing officials in this elite, but they often were in fact the same people. The Egyptian pharaoh was the equivalent of a king and a god, and also the official owner of all the land and everything else. These elites monopolized the strategic center of their cities, where they arranged for construction of massive structures that Sjoberg identifies as additional hallmark features of every pre-industrial city. You always find, he says, some enormous temple constructed for the religious leaders at the center of the city. You always find a vast granary where the food supply can be locked up and controlled. You always find a citadel within which the warrior elite can retreat for defense if the city is invaded by powerful enemies, and where as many of the other citizens of the town as possible can take refuge along with their warriors and priests. In the map of Jerusalem just shown, there was a fifth area inside the walls, the area where we find the temple and the other structures used by the city's ruling elite, also inside its own internal wall. Near this central hub, where we find the citadel, the temple, the granary, and also the private residential compounds of the elites, we also always find a central marketplace where the craftsmen and farmers and others could sell their products. The marketplace is always convenient to the location of the elites, since they are the best customers for all the products, agricultural and non-agricultural, that come out of the workshops of the pre-industrial city. In the pre-industrial city, Gideon Sjoberg detected what he believed was another universal feature of life. He believed that all such cities had the same basic way of organizing the production and distribution of goods and services, the city's economic organization. He also gave a fundamental reason why this economic similarity appeared in all such cities. All pre-industrial cities depend on what he called animate sources of energy, meaning energy provided by some living animal, such as a water buffalo or a horse or an ox or a donkey or perhaps even a man himself. In contrast, he says, industrial cities are able to draw upon inanimate energy sources such as steam power, electricity, and eventually the internal combustion engine burning petrochemicals, and even photovoltaic or atomic power. This distinction between animate and inanimate energy sources is the master key that divides all pre-industrial cities from all industrial civilization, at least for Sjoberg. He draws a whole host of conclusions from this one central fact of limited available power from only animal sources. For one thing, Sjoberg points out that in skilled craft work, the craftsman with only his own hands for power generally makes only one unit of whatever he's producing at a time. He executes the entire production process from first raw materials to final finished product. Such craft production can be extremely complex, requiring long years to perfect the techniques of it. For this reason, he says, specific types of craftsmen usually organize themselves into professional associations that he calls guilds. Though the word for such groups is different in every language, the principle of their organization is everywhere almost the same. First, a guild controls training and access to a craft or trade by requiring that you begin as an apprentice who studies and works with an established master. Once you have learned the trade, the master may give you permission to set up your own shop as a journeyman and to do the work on your own. Eventually, if you're good at your work and the others in your field accept you, you may be admitted to the ranks of the masters and allowed to train future members of the guild yourself. There are only a few such remnants of these ancient guilds in operation in today's world.
These are limited to certain skilled trades and also, interestingly, to professors in universities who still follow what is essentially a guild system. Second, because they control access to their trade and training of new members, guilds also have control of the output of whatever it is that they produce. They enforce quality standards and can kick out a guild member who does not uphold such standards, in which case that person must look for a new way to make a living. They also can to some extent control the supply of what they produce, and so control the prices they get for their products. But this control of supply and price was strictly limited in pre-industrial cities because these craftsmen, even organized into guilds, clearly remained the subjects of the ruling elites, producing at their command and often for their use. Without control over their food or even their own lives, they were in no position to try to tinker with supply and demand in order to get higher prices from their elite customers. Third, guilds also supported each other in case of unfortunate circumstances, such as illness or death, and formed some of the earliest known cooperative societies to ensure a proper burial of a member who died, or support for an injured member unable to continue with the work of the craft. In matters of training, quality control, and mutual aid, however, these guilds in ancient cities were subject to the limitation noted earlier, that the city-state itself was a distinct sovereign unit, the basic building block of the political order of the age. This self-contained sovereignty of each city-state prevented any systematic extension of guild connections and cooperation across multiple pre-industrial cities, since not only would this put into question the power of the city's local ruling elite, but usually such cities spoke different languages, followed different religions, and used different systems of money. Just as the craftsmen of the pre-industrial city usually made their items one at a time, from start to finish, with their own hands, they also generally sold their own products themselves. There were few, if any, wholesalers or other middlemen, except for the one group of truly brave, risk-taking entrepreneurs who took the chance of buying goods in one city, traveling to another foreign city, and trying to make a profit selling those goods without falling prey to bandits or losing all their gains to taxes levied on them by the rulers of every city involved. When a craftsman sells one of his own products that he has produced with his own hands, and when you as the buyer are looking directly into the eyes of the person who made the object you want, the dynamic of buying and selling is completely different from the way we enter a retail store and buy anonymous objects mass-produced in a factory in some other part of the world. Such a pre-industrial exchange is both an economic and a social transaction. Each object is one of a kind. Each craftsman is a unique individual. Each customer is also a unique individual. Or as Sjoberg puts it, there was no standardization of products in terms of size, color, quality, shape, and so on. There was also no standardization of prices. You were expected to haggle over each sale, and the refusal to engage in such personal negotiations was an insult to the other party, whether you were the craftsman or the customer. Haggling is a way to admit explicitly and directly that each party is a unique person, worthy of individual attention and time spent in discussing the sale. Even further, haggling is a way to assert your own personal charisma and strength of character, and to engage in a little friendly competition as part of every transaction. These methods of individualized production and unstandardized negotiated exchanges show us the essence of what Sjoberg says is the unifying factor in economic organization of all pre-industrial cities. He uses the same term for such social activity as other scholars who have studied these processes. He calls it particularism. This means that the unique characteristics of each produced item, each craftsman, and each customer are important considerations. No two pieces of pottery, no two loaves of bread, no two jeweled necklaces are of equal quality. No two craftsmen have the same skill, and no two customers have the same social relationship to the seller, so there can be no standard price for any object. This basic assumption at the foundation of the economy of pre-industrial cities has been eliminated from vast areas of contemporary industrial economies, replaced by mass production of virtually identical products and fixed pricing available to all customers. Only a few features of the contemporary industrial city retain the ancient principle of particularism. No two houses or pieces of land are identical or equal in value, for example, and it is here in these surviving examples of particularism that we also still find ritualized haggling over prices. In fact, the principle of particularism extends well beyond an exchange in the marketplace to become a basic principle of all life in the pre-industrial city. No two families are of equal importance or respectability. No two warriors are equal on the battlefield, even though they may fight side by side. We already saw at the beginning of this discussion of Sjoberg's article, he came to the same conclusion as Child that the limited efficiency of agriculture in ancient times only allowed for a small portion of the people in these ancient civilizations to actually live in the pre-industrial cities at their heart. Most people remained rural peasant farmers. A good example of this pyramidal social structure, with a tiny ruling elite at the top and a massive population of peasants at the bottom, can be found embodied in the system of castes, inherited by present-day India from the pre-industrial civilizations in its many millennia of history. Aryan invaders from the Caucasus in Central Asia, actually real-life Caucasians as opposed to the usual misuse of this term, swept down into the subcontinent thousands of years ago. They conquered the Neolithic village populations they found crowding the fertile landscape there, and set up a hierarchical system that then survived for longer than any other such social organization ever seen on the face of the earth, and generated some of the earliest pre-industrial cities and civilizations. Of course, it is one thing to conquer a territory and subjugate its people by force, and it is something very different to stay in control of the society you have conquered and to create some system that allows you to rule over it for thousands of years. Reliance on coercive force is actually the least efficient way to control any population. People will only do what you tell them as long as you stand in front of them with a spear. As soon as you turn your back, they may stop working or even try to kill you. What is needed is some kind of coherent system of ideas that will convince all those people that what you want them to do is actually also what they should want to do, and that it's the right thing or divinely ordained or in their own interest in some way. This is precisely why the warriors need the priests, and the priests need the warriors. If they can just get themselves working together effectively, these two groups can take control of any population for an indefinite length of time. The great mass of the rural peasantry, made up largely of the conquered original inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent, became the Sudra caste of farmers. Living religion as it eventually developed, they were known as the once-born, the people who had never been reincarnated and who were just starting out on an unimaginably long journey of successive lives that might, if they were very good and very lucky, eventually lead to an escape from a corrupt, painful, and deteriorating world into the eternal peace of nirvana. Of course, the way to make progress along this path was to live according to the instructions of the invading Aryan priests in the Brahmin caste, who told everyone to obey their rulers and work hard. The twice-born castes, who were already advancing along this path, included all the usual urban suspects: the merchants in the Vaishya caste, the Kshatriya warrior caste, and the Brahmin priests at the peak of the very steep social pyramid. This ruling elite and their non-agricultural urban specialist servants, descendants of the invading conquerors, lived in the pre-industrial cities that appeared here as early as anywhere on Earth, and that lasted for literally thousands of years, right down to the last century or two. Wherever such a pre-industrial urban culture arose, in India, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Greece or Rome, in Mexico or Nigeria or China, the non-agricultural specialists in these ancient cities began to expand human cultural horizons. Literacy and mathematics gave rise to music, art, astronomy, and medicine. People began to write down stories about themselves and their histories, an activity especially popular with ruling elites who discovered that such histories were yet another way to strengthen their control over these cities and their people. They developed trade, architecture, money, and all of the other trappings of what we have come to call civilization. This is the paradox of the vision sketched for us by both Child and Sjoberg. The pre-industrial city, as they describe it, was built on a foundation of hierarchy, based on coercive brute force of the warriors and reinforced by elaborate systems of ideas provided by the priests. The resulting civilizations were rigidly stratified, meaning that occupations, economic position, social standing, and life chances in general were largely inherited from generation to generation. It takes a powerful and effective religion or ideology to convince most of the people in such a civilization to accept their fates and to participate in a productive way to the maintenance and reproduction of such a system. Of course, the basic principle of particularism can be helpful in this situation, since the basic unit of social life in these cities was the family, just as it was in Neolithic times and just as it remains today, and since the particularistic principle means that no two family groups have the same value or prestige or power, the pre-industrial city could combine inheritance of your particular family's status, including your occupation, your neighborhood, and most other details of your life, with a pyramidal hierarchy of social positions and power. When you combine these two principles, you get rigid stratification of pretty much all aspects of life into a hierarchy that is inherited from one generation to the next and transmitted pretty faithfully over the decades, centuries, or even millennia, depending on the effectiveness of the protection racket designed by the warriors and priests in the first place. Some civilizations managed to make this work for thousands of years, while others were not quite so good at it. In the end, though, Sjoberg directs our attention to a fundamental change in the world that he believed was the final bell for pre-industrial civilizations, no matter how long they'd managed to last up to that point. He believes that this change was the Industrial Revolution. He uses this phrase in the same sense that Child talked about the Neolithic Revolution and the Urban Revolution. It is not a sudden violent overthrow of a particular government, as political scientists usually use this expression. Rather, it was a fundamental transformation of the basic conditions of life, which then rippled through all the other aspects of society and transformed pre-industrial into industrial cities. For Sjoberg, this transformation was the shift from animate to inanimate sources of energy, nothing more and nothing less. But he goes on at the end of this article to give us a number of speculations that were popular, in particular at the time he was writing these words. Quote, "The type of social structure required to develop and maintain a form of production utilizing inanimate sources of power is quite unlike that in the pre-industrial city. At the very least, extensive industrialization requires a rational, centralized, extra-community economic organization in which recruitment is based more on universalism than on particularism. A class system which stresses achievement rather than ascription, a small and flexible kinship system, a system of mass education which emphasizes universalistic rather than particularistic criteria, and mass communication," unquote. These ideas, expressed here by Sjoberg, enjoyed wide popularity throughout mid-20th century social sciences, from sociology to economics, from anthropology to political science. The idea that the Industrial Revolution was incompatible with the principle of particularism, and also incompatible with the principle of a rigidly stratified hierarchical system of inherited wealth, power, and life chances in general, sounded great because it made progress toward freedom and equality for all people seem like an inevitable byproduct of the Industrial Revolution itself, which of course nobody was going to try to reverse or undo. Over the last half-century, social science researchers have raised questions about this idea at the end of his article. The rapid increase and consolidation of inherited wealth and resulting stratification of life chances seen in many advanced industrial countries over those decades makes some people wonder whether particularism is really on the way out. The declining opportunities for social mobility in American society in particular have made people wonder whether industrial society may not be fairly compatible after all with a rigidly stratified hierarchical system of inherited wealth, power, and life chances. Could it be that the expansion of life chances and wealth for at least some of the people living below and outside the ruling elite families was only a temporary situation, caused by the sudden ability of industrial societies to create wealth even faster than the elites could absorb and control it? As industrial societies mature, will the old civilized pattern seen for so many thousands of years eventually reassert itself? Or was Sjoberg right that industrialization in the end is compatible only with universalism and achievement-based status rather than particularism and ascribed inherited status? Whatever the future has to tell us about this riddle, we can be sure that Sjoberg's distinction between pre-industrial and industrial cities will continue to be a great conceptual tool for coming to grips with what it means to live in cities in all our societies.